Just a few weeks ago, I made a video on Assassin's Creed 2, where I labeled it as my favorite entry in the series. But I included the caveat that the game is greater than the sum of its parts, with many aspects of the story and gameplay being individually improved in later games. Now, what I didn't mention was just how immediate so many of these improvements were. One day short of a year after the release of AC2, Ubisoft dropped Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, the follow-up to the immensely popular Ezio Auditore's story, and a return to Renaissance Italy, this time taking us to the papal seat of Rome. Now, I may prefer AC2, but there are many ways in which Brotherhood is a direct upgrade over its predecessor. While AC2 managed to reinvent itself based on criticism of AC1, Brotherhood's focus is more on doing the exact same thing the previous game did, just better. At face value, the graphics, the world design, and the absolute breadth of content are all a step above AC2. In fact, it's kind of difficult to understand how Ubisoft managed to make a game this good, given the circumstances. In this video, I will echo sentiments I have made many times before, namely that AC Brotherhood was Ubisoft's first crack at streamlining the process of making AC games to reduce dev time and increase product output. So many of Assassin's Creed's modern problems can be traced back to the development of this game. The dissolution of the original dev team, the switch to yearly releases, even the so-called Ubisoft formula could be argued to have been fully cemented here. When a game feels like a rushed cash grab that cuts corners to prioritize money over artistic integrity, my natural inclination is to feel like that game shouldn't have been made. And yet, I find it hard to feel that way about Brotherhood, even if, by all accounts, that is what Ubisoft did here. While the company's decision to make the game at all was the origin point of a lot of strife for this franchise, the game itself is really freaking good. That, to me, is the Brotherhood Paradox. The game is great, and I wish Ubisoft didn't make it. Or I guess I should say I wish they didn't make it like this, in a way that cost the franchise so much. But the thing is, we're not talking about the franchise in this video, we're talking about Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. And when you play Brotherhood, you're not looking at Ubisoft higher-ups chipping away at the franchise's potential, you're just looking at a good game. And that is what ends up holding weight. I'm going to get the biggest negatives out of the way first, and I think it is telling praise that the worst aspects of this game don't have anything to do with the release itself, and instead with the process of developing it. Now, AC1 was by no means a failure, but its popularity paled in comparison to what Ubisoft saw with AC2. This success did not go unnoticed by the company, and while creative director Patrice Desilets had initially intended for the IP he and his team at Montreal had created to be a trilogy, Ubisoft was not ready to let go of that Renaissance success just yet. AC3 was still going to be on the docket as the true end to Desmond's story, but the company decided they could fit in some more Ezio action in the meantime. AC3 couldn't come out until 2012, after all. Do people here even remember that this franchise used to primarily be based around the 2012 Mesoamerican calendar end of the world myth? Don't answer that. And so it went that AC Brotherhood was put into development. However, Desilets was no longer the sole creative director of the series. While Brotherhood would be built out of existing assets to be a direct sequel to AC2, a split team at the Montreal studio would start getting to work on AC3 around the same time. We know now that Desilets' original plan would have resulted in a very definitive conclusion to this universe, with Desmond and Lucy not actually succeeding in saving the world. Regardless of how that would have ended up playing out, because we really don't know just based on notes, Ubisoft clearly wasn't interested in letting the world of Assassin's Creed end. And so AC was no longer simply the brainchild of Desilets and his dedicated team at Ubisoft, but a large-scale franchise with multiple main games in development simultaneously. Now, before Brotherhood was even fully shown off at E3 during the summer of 2010, Desilets had left Ubisoft, with the company citing his need for a creative break as the reason why. It is certainly strange for the primary creator of a series to leave only a few months into the development of the next game. While I have never seen it stated outright, the timeline of events makes it easy to speculate that this change in direction for Assassin's Creed, the franchise that Desilets had thought up, helped lead to his departure.
Do I know it for a fact? I'm just saying it sure looked that way to me.
And so it was set in stone that Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, in a matter of months, not years, would come out in 2010. Studios in Annecy, Singapore, Bucharest, and Quebec City assisted in the development of this game to meet this deadline. As I stated in the intro, So much of what is wrong with Assassin's Creed now started with Brotherhood. And I'm not saying that to imply it is Brotherhood's fault, because obviously it's not, but Brotherhood was the first game to be made under these conditions. It was the first game to be developed in under a year. It was the first time 2 AC games were in development at the same time instead of dedicating all resources to one. It was the first game to split up the creative lead's original dev team. It was the game that really dug into decentralizing development and having multiple studios work in tandem to make the games faster. And it was the game that erased the original franchise plan for a trilogy, and with that, the original intentions for the modern day and its characters. And yet, as I've said many times already, these aren't necessarily things Brotherhood itself suffers for. While AC Revelations and AC3 would definitely struggle with maintaining the quality of their content due to this change in vision for the franchise, Brotherhood somehow managed to come out with better graphics and way more content than the last game. It actually leaves me pondering, are these scummy practices and cut corners only worth criticizing once they start actively resulting in worse final products? Because there are definitely things that I let slide here that I would not let slide in Revelations or AC3, because this game is just so good. It is the crux of the Brotherhood Paradox, that what I have in front of me is a great game, and yet sits within a series that may have been better off if it were never made. The company clearly took the wrong lessons here. Obviously it wasn't the amazing work of their dev teams that they saw, given that the series continues to be passed around to different studios to this day. Instead, they saw that they could tell their devs to make a game within a year, and they could not only do it, but do it fantastically. And once they saw that, this franchise was never the same. But honestly, there is an extent to which we just reach circular thought exercises now. We don't live in the timeline where Ubisoft let Desilets and his team at Montreal finish their trilogy, so it's not like I can definitively say it would have been better. We only have the timeline we are in, and in this timeline, no matter how many bad decisions led to it being made, Brotherhood is a great game. And so, having addressed these less happy ruminations on Ubisoft's gradual decline, we can now start talking about why it's so easy to forget that stuff once you have your hands on the controller. We go from discussing the butchering of this franchise's artistic integrity behind the scenes to now discussing Brotherhood's most brilliant artistic achievement, which is the city of Rome. This game's iteration of Renaissance Rome is not only gorgeous, but also a perfect backdrop for the narrative and mechanical ideas that Brotherhood aims to grapple with. The most noticeable shift from earlier games is that Brotherhood was the first AC title to center all of the action around a single city, instead of giving the player multiple locales to explore. I won't pretend nothing is lost here. I definitely do miss the excitement that comes from setting off to a new part of the map partway through the story. At the same time, Brotherhood puts a lot more work than most AC games into making its singular map diverse and interesting to explore. While cities like Constantinople or Baghdad can feel very beautiful but also very samey, Rome feels very different from one quadrant of the map to another. Vatican City's clean streets and the colorfully dangerous papal guards stand out from the dingier city proper, and outside the city you have the open hills and smaller settlements juxtaposed against iconic monuments like the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. To account for the larger area here, you can now ride your horse anywhere on the map, including within the city for the first time, and you can fast travel between the many underground tunnel entrances. The architecture is very similar to what we saw in Venice and Florence, but there is a decidedly more worn and gritty atmosphere here, with liberal use of browns and tans to portray both the age of the city and the corruption central to the plot of the game. That comes across especially well due to the fact that the textures are so much more detailed, given that the graphics saw an enormous update over AC2. You lose a bit of that Renaissance painting look, but while AC2 really needed that art style to cover up some ugly character models, AC Brotherhood legitimately looked fantastic for its time. This is probably the game's most noticeable change at a first glance, and I honestly have no idea how they made it look so much better in so short a time. But when all is said and done, it's not the visuals of Rome that won me over. Where Rome truly excels is in the content you find within it. Open-world games have always been hit or miss when it comes to giving the player interesting reasons to explore them, especially in the last decade where the genre has become so overwhelmingly ubiquitous. However, I would argue that Rome in AC Brotherhood has some of the most plot-relevant and well-integrated side content in this franchise. One of my complaints about AC2 was that there just wasn't much worth doing in the open world. Outside of the truth puzzles and the tombs, you had busy work like the races and beating up cheating husbands. AC Brotherhood is absolutely jam-packed with content at every corner of the map, and when I say content, I don't mean solving the same Merlin trial in an open field for the 30th time. I mean content that is consistently unique and that ties perfectly into the overall themes of the game. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is all about Rome from a narrative perspective. From the moment Ezio arrives in the city and Machiavelli briefs him on the depravity of this metropolis, the central goal of almost everything you do is to liberate it from Templar corruption. The clearest way that you do this is by taking down Borgia Towers, which were really cool sequences where you have to kill a Templar captain and burn down the tower at their base of operations. These are stealth and combat sandboxes that are seamlessly integrated into the open world, something I was desperately looking for in AC2. Eliminating Templar influence in a district allows you to engage in a comedic property management mechanic, where you literally buy Rome building by building. It is an expansion of the Monteriggioni system where you could make passive income as a landlord in your small town, except now you get money every time someone visits the Pantheon, apparently. It is ridiculous, but it fits into the theme that Rome is being wrestled away from the Templars at every possible level, down to each brick. And this district liberation mechanic is just the start. Brotherhood is packed with missions that let you leave for brief sojourns to handcrafted linear maps outside of the open world. The Romulus layers are the successor to the tombs of AC2, and I am especially partial to the atmospherically thick final layer, where you chase a cardinal through St. Peter's Basilica in the middle of a storm. If you want to take it further, you can leave Rome entirely via the Da Vinci War Machine missions. Not only did the devs create dedicated maps for Colli Albani, Valnerina, Naples, and Monte Circeo, but they also let the player drive a tank, shoot a machine gun, strap bombs to a flying machine, and fire a cannon from a specialized boat. Really cool set pieces that are some of the most interesting pace changers in the entire franchise. If what you want is an emotional change of pace instead, then make sure you keep your sync rate up. The higher your overall game completion, the more Christina missions you unlock. These are repressed memories of Ezio's youthful but doomed first love, and they are by far the most humanizing scenes he gets in the game. While they are short, they also give the player access to small pieces of the Florence and Venice open worlds from AC2. And all of this is just scratching the surface. Each faction of courtesans, thieves, and mercenaries gets their own series of quests. There are a bunch of guild challenges. You have a set of Templar agents who get their own missions with dedicated cutscenes. You can bet money on yourself at Bartolomeo's Club, and if you have the DLC, you can gamble on Hazard all day. There is even a full set of virtual training missions that let you practice your stealth, parkour, and combat. How many times have I complained about the games not giving us enough opportunities to play around with their mechanics? They could have gone further, but these virtual missions were a great start, and it sucks that they never returned. Now, on top of all of that, you still have the titular Brotherhood recruit system, which is one of the biggest changes the game makes. When you see someone fighting back against oppression and come to their aid, you can recruit them to the assassin cause and send them on missions around the world. But these recruits are not just stuck in menus forever. You can actually call on them to fight with you at any time. Level up your assassins enough and they become masters themselves, able to rain death upon any and all opponents. Ezio can kill anyone at any time with a gesture of his hand in this game, and the brokenness of that fact doesn't make it less cool. When you look at how Brotherhood operates as an open world, with Ezio liberating camps and doing side missions district by district, the modern gamer notices something familiar. I do not see it credited for this often, but I would argue that Brotherhood was the first Ubisoft game to fully utilize many aspects of the so-called Ubisoft formula so many people have now gotten tired of. AC1 may have started the tower trend, but after Brotherhood it felt like every open-world game was splitting its map into regions that you take control of by taking down enemy strongholds and completing district-specific side missions. We would see a shift in how Far Cry was designed with Far Cry 3 in 2012, and combined, these two franchises would shape a lot of what the open-world genre would look like for years. It might sound like I'm saying that's a bad thing, but I'm not. It isn't Brotherhood's fault that the industry went in such a repetitive direction with open-world games. It is a testament to the game's success that it laid a foundation that not only AC, but many IPs would end up unable to escape from in the future. I would argue there isn't really anything wrong with the Ubisoft formula on its own, so much as there is with the repetitive oversaturation of it in the modern gaming industry. But it does go back to what I was saying earlier. So much of what is wrong with Ubisoft can be traced back to the mentalities they started with Brotherhood, even if Brotherhood itself worked well with those mentalities. All this talk about side content, and I haven't even brought up the multiplayer mode yet. Back in this era, it felt like every single-player game needed a tacked-on multiplayer mode. It was the season pass of the PS3 era, and yet against all odds, Brotherhood did a really good job with it. Ubisoft's Annecy studio handled most of the multiplayer component, and what we have is a super creative and interesting game of cat and mouse that I have not seen replicated outside of the indie space since. This inclusion alone turned Brotherhood into a game you could get hundreds of hours out of, and it sucks that we haven't seen an iteration of this multiplayer mode in about 11 years at this point. Now my head is spinning right now because I want to make sure I remember everything because again, the jump in open world content density from 2 to Brotherhood was monumental. Most of the game may feel very similar to what came before, but I don't think it can be overstated just how influential Brotherhood would end up being to Ubisoft as a company in terms of how it would perceive open world design. Yes, it reuses a lot of assets, and the excitement of seeing a totally new locale isn't really something you get here like you do in other AC games. But at the same time, I feel like Brotherhood was the first AC game to take full advantage of its open world structure. It builds on AC2's open world design in pretty much every way and refuses to cut corners. It manages to be so content-rich compared to earlier games without falling into the trap of being bloated with irrelevant side content like later games. If there is one thing you take away from this video, let it be that the approach to the open world was by far Brotherhood's greatest accomplishment. While the world and mission design were a massive step up, parkour, combat, and stealth all play out in largely the same fashion as earlier games, albeit with some meaningful tweaks that change how an experienced player might approach Rome when compared to Florence or Jerusalem. I'll start by going over combat because at face value we can see the most extreme changes there, chief among these being the new chain kill system, where pressing the attack button right after killing an enemy will insta-kill the next one as well. If you look at reviews at the time, most people saw this as a generally positive change. The most common criticism you would see of the combat in the first 2 games was that the counter system incentivized being reactive and waiting for non-aggressive enemies to attack you, which many people found kind of boring. With this new chain kill system, the player has a reason to attack first and attack fast, which certainly did ramp up the speed of combat. What AC Combat always did best was its cinematic animations, and with this system you are going from finisher to finisher with no in-between, which definitely leans into that. One of the coolest additions is the kill streak, which feeds directly into this. If you hold the attack button during a chain kill instead of tapping it, and point the stick toward another enemy, you can start up an incredibly flashy animation where Ezio kills both at the same time. I will talk about ranged abilities more when I go over stealth, but the ability to shoot someone with your new crossbow or charge multiple knives at once in the middle of combat is certainly nice to have. Even more so is the ability to pick up heavy weapons and throw them to just annihilate whatever unlucky guard happens to be there. The downside to all of this is that it follows a common theme of Ubisoft responding to criticism of their mechanics by adding in easy, accessible gameplay components that are satisfying, but essentially override the need to engage with these deeper mechanics instead of try to fix them up. Outside of the fact that the chain kill makes the extrinsic value of any and all other combat abilities pretty much obsolete, there were some other simplifications to the base combat system that felt unnecessary to me. For example, the timing-based rhythm kills of AC 1 and 2 are gone, with Ezio insta-killing any enemy you complete a full combo on no matter your timing, meaning you can now just mash the button. I erroneously applied this change to AC 3 in my video on that game, but it actually started here. The kick function also streamlines fighting tougher enemies because it stuns them and opens them up to an instant kill combo as well, removing any defensive challenge they might pose. In my AC2 video, I talked about how the game suffered from simple enemy archetypes that encouraged limiting your play to the counter system most of the time. In Brotherhood, this issue is even more present because even the strongest of the Papal Guard can be killed with the press of a button. No enemy except maybe Borgia captains give the player a reason to taunt, throw sand, dodge, or disarm, outside of the desire to look cool. And while I 100% believe that intrinsic motivation is valuable, I do not think that means Ubisoft shouldn't be held accountable for building out a combat system that provides so few incentives to explore it. How much mileage you get out of the combat system here will really be up to how much this immense power fantasy appeals to you. If you wanted a deeper system than AC2, then this really doesn't do that. But if you wanted more of the flashy combat of AC2, this admittedly takes things up a notch. And if we're being honest, it makes sense that they would lean into the parts that they already did well, instead of building up the parts that could have used some work, even if that isn't my own preference. Now, parkour saw fewer changes, with the control scheme and architectural assets staying very consistent with AC2 outside of some nice additions. For example, you can now find these lifts that let you instantly scale some buildings, and the ability to ride your horse in the city was seamlessly integrated into the base movement system. The diversity of each region of Rome pulls its weight a lot here when it comes to making traversal feel unique. No matter how similar the system is to what came before, I can certainly say that the scale of climbing the outside of the Castel Sant'Angelo or the Colosseum feels pretty much unlike anything we had gotten before this. I almost forgot, you also get a parachute. I pretty much never use it, but it's kind of fun that it's there. Because so much of Brotherhood's parkour is so identical to AC2, I had a brief chat with the very talented Animus Drifter, who has some of the best parkour showcases of the older games on this platform, since I knew he would have more insight into the little details that did change than I would, given his expertise. He let me know about some changes to the way that Ezio interfaces with his environment that I wouldn't have noticed otherwise, but that also indicate a slight shift in mentality away from player agency that I think is worth noting regardless. For example, you have less omnidirectional control when doing an eject from an incomplete wall run, with the game really wanting you to stick to going directly back or directly to the sides. For whatever reason, Ezio also doesn't magnetize as well to objects that aren't perfectly perpendicular to where he was hanging from, sometimes sliding right off of ledges if they are at an angle that he usually, but not always, would have ejected onto smoothly in AC2. Drifter also talked with me about how there tend to be fewer options for vertical movement outside of prescribed parkour paths in Rome when compared to Florence or Venice. In Rome, you have way more instances where you get a bunch of posts laid out horizontally that don't allow for a ton of vertical experimentation, which sometimes makes the world feel a little less intentionally designed. Or perhaps it was just an attempt to make the walls seem less busy, at the expense of consistently complex parkour pathways. All this being said, I still do consider Brotherhood to be very nearly on par with AC2's parkour system, which, as I have said, is my favorite in the series. So it's not like these are debilitating criticisms to me. And please note that Animus Drifter also praised Brotherhood's traversal system as one of the best in the series. I focus on criticisms he provided because those were the detail-oriented components that I wouldn't have found myself. However, if you would like to explore parkour depth in these games further, you would be better served by checking out Animus Drifter's channel yourself, which I will also link below, as opposed to listening to me parrot his ideas. While parkour is mostly the same with some alterations causing me to lean toward AC2, stealth is the opposite. Brotherhood certainly doesn't reinvent the stealth systems of the older games, which I have always described as mechanically fascinating, but practically disappointing, given Ubisoft's constant limiting of your opportunities to use them. Brotherhood is by no means perfect in that regard, but it directly addresses one of my biggest issues with AC2, which was that the game so rarely incentivized delving into the deeper stealth mechanics, especially social stealth. We see this even by looking at the main mission design. You have a lot more missions in AC Brotherhood that actually give you a target or objective out in the open that allow you to use social stealth to get where you are trying to go, when compared to AC2. Now, in terms of basic stealth, the biggest mechanical addition was the large increase in ranged abilities that Ezio has. The most obvious here is the crossbow, which has a ton of ammo and is silent, and can be shot in combat, making it so overpowered that it can honestly steamroll most of the game for you. In addition to that, you can charge your knives to take out 3 enemies at once. The gun is a lot faster to fire now, and both the poison dart and smoke bombs can now be aimed as projectiles. You combine this with the assassin recruit system I mentioned earlier, where you can kill entire groups with a single button, and it's clear that Ubisoft was not trying to up the challenge factor here. This of course also carries over things like the ability to hire courtesans to become essentially invisible, plus the really long blend fade time that already made AC2 so forgiving. Again, like with most aspects of Brotherhood, the point was to achieve a power fantasy, even if that overshadows existing mechanical depth. And like with combat, the mileage you get here will vary depending on how much you value making your own challenge versus how much you expect the devs to balance out challenging mission and level design themselves. During my chat with Animus Drifter, he recommended I talk to Kenography, a YouTube channel which focuses primarily on social stealth. One of the primary improvements he identified here was the overall integration of stealth opportunities into the open world. There are a lot of areas in Brotherhood with high crowd density, and guard pathing that consistently allows you to make use of environmental stealth opportunities, like haystacks, crowds, and benches, in contrast to AC2, which sometimes felt a lot sparser. This is especially true with the addition of the Borgia Towers, which increase enemy presence in the open world and present the player with way more zones where stealth can be utilized. Although to get something out of the way, this isn't a gameplay component that is strictly tied to stealth, but it feels like as good a time as any to express my absolute abhorrence for the full sync requirements introduced in this game. They aren't terrible on paper. I love challenges tied to different styles of play in games like Hitman or Dishonored, but I despise how they're handled here. Oftentimes these requirements will seem really arbitrary, and failure to complete them means you need to start the whole mission over if you want full sync. You can't just reset the checkpoint. As far as sneaking around goes, they also put further attention on the weird detection system that this game carries over from AC2, where guards can detect you as you are murdering them. Now you have missions where you might need to restart because a guy who is already dead apparently just saw you, if the full sync requirement is to not get caught at all. This was already annoying due to the game's penchant for instant fail mechanics if you were detected, but this added salt to that wound. It also runs contrary to the game's strengths. They built this whole system where you have so much time to kill an enemy after detection before being forced into combat, and yet you can't utilize it in so many situations. For example, one really cool mechanic that I discovered from Keenography is what he calls combat stealth. What this essentially entails is that instead of assassinating a guard, you perform a combat finisher, but then you use the kill streak mechanic to quickly kill the other guards before they can even react. This looks really cool in practice, giving you that real John Wick feel when you pull it off, but because you are briefly seen, this counts as detection, so there are a lot of missions where this results in failure. Again, another thing I probably wouldn't have found on my own. You can go to Keenography's channel for more info on social stealth, and you'll get more out of that topic there than here. The main thing that I do want you to come away with, even with these criticisms, is that as far as stealth goes, while I still wish Ubisoft did more with their unique systems, Brotherhood was definitely a step in the right direction in my opinion. I found myself engaging with stealth way more, the stealth set pieces in both missions and the open world were more enjoyable, and even when the tools were too easy, they were certainly very fun. And overall, when talking about the gameplay in Brotherhood, it is clear that Ubisoft did what they were trying to do. They wanted to make the game look as aesthetically perfect as was possible in 2010 while streamlining their mechanics, and they did a great job of that. A part of me does wish they chose to make the systems deeper instead of painting over them with satisfying but shallow mechanics, because a lot of the additions that actually came from this game involve being able to perform previously complex actions with the press of one button. With lifts, you can instantly scale buildings. With your assassins and your ranged weapons, you can clear zones without getting close to anyone, and with the chain kill, you can eliminate most enemies within seconds by essentially mashing one button. There is a shift towards simplicity here that I think loses out on some of the potential of the more in-depth mechanics. And yet, at the same time, admittedly, on the whole, I did find myself having more fun here than I did in AC2 anyways. Ezio is so incredibly lethal and overpowered in this game that I did really enjoy finding new ways to just obliterate any guard in my path. Even with all the rough edges that I wished were sanded down in later games, I don't feel out of line in saying that Brotherhood is the Ezio game I had the most fun playing. In my AC2 video, I had a lot of hang-ups about a variety of different individual components, but it all came down to the story for me. My thoughts on Brotherhood are very different, not because I think the story is bad by any means, but just because I don't really think about it much at all. That already sounds more critical than I mean it to be. I enjoy the story in Brotherhood, and I think one could easily make the argument that it is paced more coherently than its predecessor. The game is all about Ezio going after Cesare Borgia and liberating Rome, and it never strays far from that singular focus. It starts with a bang with the attack on Monteriggioni and the death of Mario providing ample stakes to justify another adventure with Ezio. After that, the game slows down quite a bit, with the focus of the narrative turning to introducing both Ezio and the player to the preparations necessary to be ready to fight the Templars. Like AC2, this simple narrative is bolstered heavily by the characters within it. There are fewer this time around since there is only one city, and you only need one contact from each of the three factions you ally with in the game. La Volpe and Bartolomeo return from AC2 to lead the thieves and the mercenaries respectively, and each of them gets a lot more time to shine than the last game. The courtesans are taken over by Claudia, Ezio's sister, in a move that I appreciated a lot. A criticism that I kind of glossed over in my AC2 video is that Claudia and the auditory matriarch Maria got very little to do within the confines of the plot. Brotherhood largely fixes this, making both characters valuable additions to Ezio's story. Watching Ezio come to terms with the fact that Claudia was forced in many ways to grow up and fend for herself alone was really meaningful to me in a game where Ezio didn't really get that many opportunities to grow. Now that in itself isn't really a criticism of Ezio, so much as it is an observation given the nature of this game. Coming off the tail of a story where we spent 20 years with one character, Brotherhood was never going to provide the same level of development. Ezio is suave, cool, and confident in the beginning, and while he makes some mistakes and certainly isn't totally perfect, he is largely the same man at both ends of this plot. In most conflicts within the game, he is the level head coming in and saving the day. That being said, I do like the vulnerability the game explores when it comes to his relationships with women. While AC2 gave me the impression Ezio had a partner for every day of the week, the Christina missions make it clear that Ezio had one real love for most of his life. And when interacting with Caterina Sforza, Ezio tends to be on his back foot, seemingly romantically attached to her even though he knows she sees him as a political ally first and foremost. Again, in a game where a lot of his character development was already done by the intro, this stuff was cool to see. As far as bad guys go, Cesare is a gleefully evil villain, making Rodrigo seem relatively grounded by comparison. He isn't even really acting as a Templar, with his goals simply aligning with his real historical motivation to conquer Italy in the name of the Pope. He has no higher aspirations regarding control or peace, he just wants power and will obtain it by any means necessary. He may not be deep, but he is charming and steals every scene he's in. The supporting villains work pretty well too, although maybe we could have done with a couple more. Cesare has 3 primary subordinates, his banker, Juan Borgia, the French Baron de Valois, and his hitman, Micheletto. You also get some sinister scenes from Cesare's sister-lover Lucrezia and the returning Rodrigo, a shell of his former self after his defeat by Ezio. Each of them gets a fair amount of time in the limelight, but like with AC2, there isn't much focus on their motivation or personal belief. These villains are entertaining obstacles, and they fulfill that role well. It is worth noting that you don't really start going after Cesare in earnest until about the halfway point of the game. It might have been nice to have a little more going on narratively between the fall of Monteriggioni and when Ezio finally starts going after targets, but while I find this strange in hindsight, I never actually felt like the pace was slowing down too much when I first played it, because the narrative does a pretty good job of consistently introducing you to new ideas and characters. That being said, there were some aspects of the story I really didn't mesh with that much. For example, Ezio's decision to spare Rodrigo Borgia at the end of AC2 remains a really weird one, and it isn't addressed in this game in an especially satisfying way. As we know, Ubisoft didn't intend to make this game when AC2 was drafted, so it's likely that they didn't expect to have to actually contend with the consequences of Ezio allowing a Templar to remain in one of the highest positions of power in the world. In the novelization of AC2 titled AC Renaissance, the ending actually takes place in 1503 instead of 1499, and Rodrigo does end his own life with poison. It's possible that was the original ending for AC2, and for whatever reason they changed it around, and Brotherhood just ended up having to build a story off of that last-minute change. You might think there would be some kind of character arc that comes from this, but Ezio doesn't really feel like he changes much at all after his failure to kill Rodrigo leads to the death of Mario, and the wasting of a lot of my time buying property in Monteriggioni. It feels like this huge thing that should totally recontextualize his character and the way other characters perceive him, but outside of some arguing in the first act, it feels more like a loose end from AC2 that they just didn't know how to tackle. It kind of takes away from the arc in AC2 for me, because when you actually get to see the aftermath of his decision to spare him, even with Rodrigo's defeated state, Brotherhood offers exactly 0 reasons why letting him live wasn't an objectively bad idea. Another weird plot point is basically everything to do with Machiavelli. Throughout the game, he is constantly antagonistic to Ezio, and his shady actions lead La Volpe to believe he may actually be a traitor. It goes so far that Ezio ends up having to save Machiavelli's life after he uncovers the real traitor mere moments before Volpe intends to shank Machiavelli in the streets. And then after this, he admits he was always supporting Ezio, and he was just lying to pretend he hadn't constantly been helping him throughout the story. Like, why, man? And he was such a prick about it too. Why did you have to be so dramatic? I get some need for secrecy if you don't know who you can trust, but he was so secretive it almost got him killed, and it all felt so unnecessary and silly. But despite my harping on about these things, None of them actually hurt my impression of the story all that much. I was sufficiently entertained from beginning to end. The performances were solid, the story moved fast enough for me, and I found each subsequent story beat satisfying. But the story is also one of the big reasons why I'd say this is not a top 3 game in the series for me. Again, not at all because it's bad, but just because I don't think about it much. AC2 resonated so much with me emotionally, even with its flaws, functioning as a decades-long epic centered around one kid who grows into an adult. Brotherhood is very much an "and then this happened" kind of story, showcasing a tale worth telling, but not one that compares at all in terms of emotional stakes to AC2. It's worth remembering that Brotherhood was not made to be the second part of a trilogy, any more than AC2 was made to be the first part of one. To be an addendum to the complete story that was AC2 was all Brotherhood wanted to be narratively. It was Revelations that would retroactively decide to make Ezio's journey a 3-game arc, with a beginning, middle, and end. And there isn't really anything wrong with that. It's still a perfectly fine and oftentimes enjoyable story. It just doesn't have the same kick that AC2 does. There are so many moments that give me chills upon replay in AC2, from the title card, to Ezio getting the robes, to the Bonfire of the Vanities speech. I don't have scenes in Brotherhood that I think back to on a regular basis. It's solid, from beginning to end, but it doesn't really try to exceed that. If someone hypothetically could only play 2 games in the Ezio trilogy, then Brotherhood is the one I would tell them to skip. I think AC Brotherhood is a much higher quality game than AC Revelations, but it just offers less to Ezio's overall story, even if I think it handled the story it does tell better than its sequel. Again, don't misconstrue that as me saying I don't like it, or that I even wish the stakes were higher than they are. I like that this is a smaller scale game. For what it wants to be narratively, it hits all the right marks. It's just not trying to hit marks that are quite as interesting as what they're trying to do with the other 2 Ezio games. Briefly, I also want to touch on the modern day. There's actually a lot to like about the modern day compared to some of the other games in this series, but it also falls into the category of things that were a problem in hindsight, but don't actually impact Brotherhood itself all that negatively. What I like about it is that Desmond finally seems to be coming into his own. He is confident, his relationship with Lucy is growing, and he has earned the trust of Sean and Rebecca. He doesn't feel like the fourth wheel, he is a part of the team. He doesn't have many scenes in the game, but he is a much more enjoyable character than he ever was in the past when he is on screen. And the player finally gets to parkour around with him. In fact, this is the only time Desmond gets to parkour around an open-world map in the series. My hang-up, however, comes from the climax. The death of Lucy. When they find the apple in the Colosseum Temple at the very end of the game, Desmond loses control of his body, and the god Juno seems to force him to kill Lucy, and the screen cuts to black. Now at the time, this felt really effective to me. I was so invested. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And then we saw what happened next. Revelations came out, and they barely acknowledged Lucy at all. That was pretty disappointing. In hindsight, you realize that in making this game at all, Ubisoft had already given up on the original plan for the modern-day characters, given that Lucy was clearly supposed to have a bigger role in the franchise's big finale. Now, of course, I don't personally know what Kristen Bell's contracts for these games look like, but it's not hard to imagine that paying a big-name actress like her for 5 games was very different from paying her for a trilogy. It leaves me wondering if they had planned to pay her for 3 games, and once the decision was made to extend Desmond's saga beyond that, Ubisoft axed her for the sake of money. That feeling of wondering how this bold ending was going to be followed up has since been replaced with the understanding that, by this point, they were just making it up as they went along, with no actual plan for how Desmond would go out anymore, no actual plan for what would happen after this scene. This destruction of the modern day is a big part of why I think the decision to make Brotherhood was a mistake in of itself. If they had put all their resources into making AC3, then maybe, at the very least, Desmond, Subject 16, Lucy, and Warren Vidic could have gotten satisfying endings. But it was in Brotherhood that the original idea of Desmond and Lucy searching for temples and defeating Templars was thrown out, replaced by the cobbled-together ending where each character would end up going out with a whimper by the end of AC3. But to Brotherhood's credit, it hadn't gotten that bad yet here. At least the content here is captivating, even if it was all dead ends. Lucy's death had me on the edge of my seat, and the Subject 16 puzzles left me aching for more. At the time, I didn't know they had already given up. But unlike AC Revelations and AC3's modern day, at the very least Brotherhood feels like they were trying. And that effort is something I feel throughout this entire story. Nothing in this narrative blows my mind, but it does its best to respect these characters in a way that later games drop the ball on. Isolating it from the calamity that would come later and seeing it as a vessel to spend more time with Ezio and the cast I had grown so attached to in AC2, there is more than enough value in this story. I like so many things about Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, and it's honestly one of the most complete packages in this franchise. It is itself a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of the devs at Ubisoft Montreal back in 2010 that they put out a product of this quality in spite of the limited dev time and reworking of the franchise's entire trajectory. But, at the same time, the fact that the quality is high doesn't absolve Ubisoft of criticism for the limited dev time and for the reworking of the franchise's trajectory. The decision to make Brotherhood set in motion a series of events that would transform the IP into something entirely unrecognizable. You would think Ezio, one of the most popular protagonists Ubisoft ever created, would be deserving of games that got as much time and creative opportunity as needed. Instead, the company forced the team to launch in less than a year as part of a new release plan so perverse that it very possibly led to the exit of the creative lead of the entire series. And yet, how much does all of this matter? How much does it matter when the game perfected the typical open-world formula of the 2010s, radically improved the visuals of the franchise, and is so clearly full of this much effort and passion? I have heard some argue that they feel like it's a glorified spin-off that could have been a DLC expansion. But even if that's the case, even if you believe that, then Ubisoft should be ashamed that one of its most polished experiences came from a last-minute title they paid to get cobbled together within a year. With Brotherhood, there was more than enough love clearly put into the experience that it is easy to separate the game itself from its impact on the wider franchise. And so while I think it is healthy to continue to be critical of where Ubisoft allowed greed to fester in this series, and to be critical of that impact on the wider franchise, the most salient point I think I have to make on Brotherhood is this: that in spite of it all, Ubisoft made a great game, and I was glad to be able to play it again for this video. That is what I came away with. Maybe it shouldn't have been made. In fact, personally, I believe it shouldn't have been made. But we live in a world where it was made. And since that's the case, at the very least we live in a world where it is fantastic. That is all I have for today. I intend to go right into my video on Revelations, and then I will have chatted with you all about the entire Ezio trilogy, which is nice. Usually the ideas I have for videos are just whatever comes to mind. This is just a hobby I do when I get home from work, so there isn't a lot of rhyme and reason to what I end up making. But I do want to get to the videos that people request, and this was one of them. Revelations will be one of them, and we'll see what I get to after that. It's been a blast going through them all, although maybe people will be a little meaner when I start going over how many more corners Ubisoft started cutting with Revelations, and the fact that they're a lot more noticeable than with Brotherhood. But that is a discussion for that video. For now, my indie recommendation of the month, since I'm still doing that, is Night in the Woods. This game had a profound effect on me when I played it for the first time about a year ago, and I think it's a great fall game, if you're in the market for one of those right now. Anyhow, let me know your thoughts on Assassin's Creed Brotherhood in the comments, and otherwise have a great day, and take care of yourself.